Hello and welcome to What is Neurodiversity and How the Hell Did We Get Here? This is not a debate before I go any further, and it's not about me trying to convince you on what to think and believe. I'm here simply to have an open ended conversation and explore something far more interesting and fascinating. How different societies, cultures, institutions, and researchers have tried to explain human difference throughout history. Because human difference is not new, the explanations for it are. That is the thread running through this entire presentation. You may also notice a small megaphone on the slides in the corner. Whenever you see it, that means I'm stepping away from the slide itself and into the messy bits, the context, the nuance, the parts that do not fit neatly in one presentation. Because let's face it, human beings are not simple species. We have always been complicated and messy. You will also notice that this presentation and future videos will intentionally be low stimulation. No dramatic music, no flashy effects, no transitions powerful enough to launch your laptop into orbit. None of that. This is intentional because the purpose of these videos are designed to be accessible resources that can be shared between parents, professionals, educators, students, and anyone else who finds them useful. The focus is to stay on the information, the conversation, and the topic. Now, before history starts doing what history does best, and making everyone slightly uncomfortable, a quick disclaimer. Throughout this presentation, we will touch on culture, religion, medicine, gender, politics, science, and social systems. Not because I am attacking any of them, because all of them have shaped how societies understood human difference, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously. As with everything on the inclusive voice, you do not have to agree with me. The aim is not agreement. The aim is curiosity, challenging, and having open ended conversations. Most importantly, I am someone who believes that understanding starts with asking questions and not following blindly. So grab your cup of tea, grab a cup of coffee, grab an energy drink if your executive functioning requires a bit of chemical encouragement. I get it. And let's find out how the hell we got here. What is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity, the idea that human brains naturally vary. People have always differed in how they think, learn, communicate, process information, experience the world. Human differences is not new. Our understanding of it is. Neurodivergent, a term used to describe individuals whose neurological development differs from what society considers typical. Examples include autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, Tourette syndrome, and other neurological differences. Where did the idea come from? The term neurodiversity was coined in the late 1990s by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer. It challenged the idea that all brains should develop, learn, and behave in the same way. The real question: neurodivergent people did not suddenly appear in the 1990s. Human difference has existed throughout history. What changed was the explanation, the language, the assumptions, the response. And that is where our story begins. Early records of human difference, and this is between ancient world and up until 1800s. Different eras, different explanations. And before I go any further, you need to understand the presentation goes from timeline to timeline, and it's very concise. I've tried to keep it concise, hence why the megaphone comes into the corner. So the presentation shows you bullet points and small memorable information. And where I go off and talk about the nuance and the context, I give you that what that era was like and how it connects to today and how it connects to how neurodiverse individuals are seen throughout history and what was documented. So, ancient Greece and Rome. Individuals described as solitary, intense focus, and special interests noted. Unusual social behaviors recorded. Ancient Persia, medical writings discussed differences in behavior and learning. Early observations of development, variation. Ancient India, texts describe diverse ways of thinking, communicating, and behaving. Differences often viewed through philosophical and spiritual lenses. Islamic Golden Age, 8th and 14th century. Scholars studied behavior, cognition, and mental health. Observation began replacing purely supernatural explanations. Imperial China, historical records describe individuals who struggled with social norms or learned differently. Differences was observed even when not medically defined. Indigenous cultures worldwide. Many communities recognized differences through roles rather than deficits. Some individuals were valued for pattern recognition, memory, storytelling, spiritual leadership, knowledge keeping, deep focus on specialized tasks. Difference was not always viewed as something to fix. Human difference existed everywhere. What changed from culture to culture was how it was understood. I also want you to take into the fact that science and medicine always has existed in different forms. Now, throughout the eras and throughout the world, it has evolved. But it hasn't necessarily evolved for the best. Um, a lot of mistakes were made in medicine and science. Now, I know from this era and the era before this, there was a lot of holistic medicine. Medicine, as in, the indigenous tribes, different tribes would have different leaves or different stuff from nature that was beneficial, that would cure ailments and illnesses. And this has been recorded. But aside that, they also documented individuals who had differences. One of the biggest myths surrounding neurodiversity is that it suddenly appeared sometimes around the invention of Wi Fi, as if humanity spent thousands of years producing identical children, and then one day somebody connected to broadband and everyone collectively developed ADHD. History says otherwise. Long before psychology, psychiatry, or diagnostic manuals, people were already noticing differences in how individuals thought, learned, communicated, and behaved. We see it in the records of ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, India, China, the Islamic Golden Age, and indigenous cultures around the world. Now, they were not exactly documenting it the way we do today and calling it autism or ADHD as we do today. These words did not exist. What they were documenting were people, the quiet one, the intensely focused one, the person who struggled socially, the person who seemed to be running on a completely different operating system from everyone else. And it wasn't just adults, it was children too. In other words, human variations. What changed was not the people. What changed was how societies explained them. Because humans are brilliant at spotting patterns. Explaining them accurately is where things get a bit questionable. Some differences were respected, some were feared, some were celebrated, some were punished. The response often said more about the culture than the individual. And that is really the point of this slide. Human differences existed everywhere. The explanation depended on who was doing the explaining. I also would like you to remember racial hierarchies and all of the power, greed, and control existed in the ancient world as well, which defined how an individual who was different was treated or looked at. Before we had science, of course, we had explanations. And this is prehistory, BCE, ancient civilizations, and 1800s, like I said in the previous slide. Now, prehistory, 3000 BCE, we're looking at the primitive brain, the survival instinct. That was the sole purpose of that time. Where to get food, how to hunt, how to protect life, as in surviving, breathing, the small groups, small tribes. So, before psychology, neuroscience, and diagnostics, humanity were busy trying not to die. And that is quite literal. And we see this through different eras. Early life involved disease, famine, war, predators, extreme hardship, high child mortality. The brain evolved to prioritize survival by asking safe or dangerous, familiar or unfamiliar, friend or threat. Difference was often noticed long before it was understood. Power, hierarchy, and social order. This has been there through the beginning of time. As civilizations expanded, it has changed. Societies became organized around class systems, wealth, authority, gender roles, religion, race and ethnicity, productivity. Those in power often decided what was normal, who belonged, who had value, who could lead, who should obey. Difference was often judged against the needs of the system. Religion, culture, and belief. When difference could not be explained, explanations often came through spiritual beliefs, morality, tradition, family honor, community expectations. Over time, explanations became traditions, traditions became culture, culture became common sense and an excuse to treat people differently or not understand it. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. Before we had science, we had explanations, and humans are exceptionally good at creating explanations when they do not have the answers. For most of history, survival came first. People were dealing with famine, disease, war, hard child mortality, and the general inconvenience of trying not to die before the age of 40. Nobody was sitting around discussing neurodevelopment. They were busy surviving. And science and medicine at that time was limited to that time. As societies grew, so did systems of power, kings and queens, religious authorities, empires, science, medicine, class systems, patriarchal structures, colonial expansion, ideas about race, ideas about gender, ideas about who belonged and who did not. And once power enters the conversation, again, explanations become much more than explanations. They become rules, they become laws. People learn from family, religion, community, and traditions. One generation passed beliefs to the next. There was schools at the time, there was education at the time, but it was very limited and it was a privilege if you knew how to read and write. And in some eras, if you knew how to read and write, it you were considered the leader of the time or someone special because it was very uh they didn't understand the full concept that everybody could do it. It was very limited and it was a privilege. A few hundred years later, nobody remembers where the ideas came from, yet everyone treats it as common sense. Humans have remarkable talent for turning, oh, I heard this somewhere, into everybody knows this is true. So pretty much turning excuses and rumors and things that have been, hand being down family heirlooms into this is truth and this is gospel. This is what's, it's just end all be all. That is how assumptions became traditions, how traditions became culture, and how culture became something people stopped questioning. And before I go any further, it is not to say that everything was wrong or all traditions and cultures and assumptions were wrong or all explanations were wrong. No. But there were certain that we still cling on to today that, if you look at the core of it, doesn't make sense and is not valuable to carry on. Does that make sense? This matters because science did not arrive in a fresh, empty room. It arrived in societies already shaped by hierarchy, inequality, and deeply rooted beliefs about human value. So, yes, science medicine always existed, but as it evolved, so did how the narrative went about human life and who to value and who not to value and who gets importance and who doesn't get importance. The tools were about to change. The people using them had not. And that is where our story goes next. Because the questions were finally improving, yes, the assumptions took a little longer to catch up. So now we have the age of science. Between 1700s to early 1900s, the explanation changes again. Observation replaces assumption. Scientific revolution, medical research expands, human behavior becomes a subject of study. New questions emerge. Why are people different? How does development occur? Can behavior be understood and fixed? Can difference be classified? New systems appear: hospitals, psychiatry, medical institutions, early psychological theories. The reality: science challenged old beliefs. Society's biases came along for the ride. So that is your power, your greed, your all of the dark side. It's still coming for the ride, even though science, knowledge, and medicine evolved through the times. The questions improved, the assumptions took longer to catch up. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. So, science has entered the chat in an evolved shape. Great, lovely, progress. Except society immediately did what science society does best and thought, brilliant. How can we use this to make everyone behave properly or fit into boxes? By the Industrial Revolution, the world was changing fast. And you've noticed that I have not mentioned patriarchal systems and colonial systems because I think it goes hand in hand without saying. But when that it is another conversation to have. But what I want you to take away is yes, patriarchal system, colonial systems did affect how science evolved, how medicine evolved, and how difference was seen or dictated or transpired into recorded and documented literature on paper, right? Now, when I talk about industrial revolution, I also want you to think about the school systems and the workplace systems that we have currently. So, by the Industrial Revolution, the world was changing fast. Factories needed workers who could follow routines. Schools needed children who could sit still, listen, repeat, and perform on schedule. Governments needed citizens who were productive, obedient, and easy to organize because the world was about to take a drastic turn when it comes to population, when it comes to rules, when it comes to power and hierarchy and government. Basically, society started building itself around the idea of what an ideal citizen is: predictable, efficient, compliant, measurable. Which sounds lovely until you remember human beings are not washing machines. Children, especially, did not suddenly become standard issue because someone invented a timetable. But this is when and where many of the school systems we still recognize today begin taking shape. Same age group, same lessons, same pace, same tests, same expectations. Everyone measured against the same invisible ruler and normal. For some children, this opened doors. Education became more widely available. Development was studied more closely. Support slowly became possible. But The darker side is that children who did not fit the system were often treated as the problem, not the system, the child. And is this familiar to what we see in today's era? And that is where things became dangerous because this era was not just about innocent observations. And I would like you to remember that at this era of age of science and industrialization and standardization, it also included human testing, experiments, harsh institutions, and attempts to physically train and cognitively train and correct and force people into what society considered acceptable. Now, if we look at the era and we look at the power at the time, the Western world, as what we like to call the first world countries, major countries that were developing, that had, you know, they were developing, they had science and medicine, but the mindset was still stuck on fixing people. And there's loads of documented experiments that have taken place, especially with children who were different or communicated different or didn't speak or were autistic at the time. They were either classed as having childhood schizophrenia, or they were tested and trained pretty much how you would train a dog. And that is the dark side, and it is another conversation to have, but it's a very dark side of history. It also included human testing, experiments, all of that. So disabled people, poor people, women, racialized communities, children who behave differently all went through this cruel and harsh treatment. Anyone outside the expected norm could become something to study, manage, rank, or fix. And a lot of people love skipping over that bit because it ruins the shiny story of progress. Science helped us understand more, yes, but it was also used inside systems already shaped by class, race, gender inequality, colonization, patriarchy, and power. So the tools improved. The mindset did not magically become empathetic or kind. That is why this period matters, because many of the ideas we still see in 2026 did not appear from nowhere. The obsession with sitting still, learning the same way, measuring children constantly, ranking ability, rewarding compliance, treating difference as disruption and disorder, a lot of that has roots here. This is when difference stopped being simply noticed, it became measured, and the need arose to fix it. And once something can be measured, society starts deciding who is ahead and who is behind and who needs correcting and fixing. So, yes, the questions improved, but the assumption and the mindset did not. They came along for the ride, sitting comfortably in the back seat. Industrialization, standardization, and the ideal citizen. This is between 1700s and early 1900s. Industrial revolution. Factories expand, productivity matters, efficiency rewarded, society becomes structured. Educations change, mass schooling grows, timetables introduced, standardized learning, children compared to peers. The new normal, the ideal child, sits still, follows instructions, learns predictability, produces measurable outcomes. Why it matters. Difference is no longer simply noticed. Difference is now measured. And once it can be measured, it can be ranked and the attempt to fix it, basically. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. So, science is improving along with medicine. Society is becoming more organized, and then industrialization arrives and basically says, excellent, let's put everyone on the timetable. For most of human history, communities were relatively small, people contributed in different ways. Difference was often visible, but not necessarily measured or fixed. Now, factories are growing, cities are expanding, schools are becoming more common, and suddenly there is a growing demand for people who can fit neatly into systems. Turn up on time, follow instructions, do the task, stay quiet, and repeat. Schools quickly began reflecting the same idea. Children sat down in rows, followed schedule, learned the same lessons, took the same tests, and kept quiet, and were increasingly compared to one another. Not because teachers were evil, because the system was designed to create consistency and conformity. The challenge is that human beings are not particularly consistent, especially children. Some learn by listening, some learn by doing, some learn by moving, some by asking 17,000 questions before breakfast. We've all been there. And yet, the system increasingly rewarded one type of learner, the child who could sit still, follow instructions, learn predictability, and produce measurable results. In other words, the child who fit the system. That is why this period matters. For the first time, difference was not simply being observed, it was being compared and fixed. Then comparison has a funny habit of turning into judgment. Because once society starts deciding what is normal, it inevitably starts deciding what is not. And that is where things begin taking a darker turn. Eugenics and the system. This is between 1880s and 1945 when science met power. The idea. Society could be improved. Some traits were viewed as desirable, others were viewed as undesirable. When science met existing power structures, industrialization, nationalism, colonial thinking, class systems, patriarchal ideals, race hierarchies. The consequences? Institutionalization for many, many children and adults who were different and did not fit the system. Forced sterilization for families and women, especially, who did not fit the neat box. Segregation, loss of rights, and generational trauma. The legacy? Disability stigma, deficit thinking, fixing difference, and judging human value. Just remember the age, the timeline of this. It is the 1880s and the 1945. This is, we're talking about our great great grandparents. So it's not even that old. When science stopped asking why people were different and started deciding which differences deserved to exist, history took a dangerous turn. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. And this is where the spreadsheet gets dangerous because once society starts measuring people, comparing people, and ranking people, somebody eventually asks which people are better and desirable. As it turns out, that question was a disaster. By this point, schools were comparing children already, doctors were measuring development and attempting to fix them, institutions were deciding who was normal and who was not, and they were practically overcrowded. Difference was no longer simply observed, again, it was measured, and the need to fix it was huge. And once something can be measured, people start assigning value to it. That is where eugenics enter the story. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions is that this was only a German problem. It was not. Germany became infamous for taking these ideas to horrific extremes. But eugenic thinking existed across Britain, America, Canada, Australia, Sweden, and many, many other Western countries. The details varied. The mindset was remarkably similar. Some traits were viewed as desirable, others were viewed as undesirable. Some people were considered valuable, others were considered a burden. When you strip away all the scientific language, reports, statistics, that was the argument. The uncomfortable truth is that there was never just one motivation. Some people genuinely believed they were helping society. Others were protecting their wealth, their status, and existing power structures. Some were driven by prejudice, some were by fear, some by greed, some by control and power, superiority complexes rooted in ideas about race, class, disability, and human worth. History is rarely a battle between good people and bad people. More often, it is a mixture of ignorance, power, prejudice, and people convincing themselves they are justified to belong. Eugenics sat right in the middle of all of it. The consequences, again, were devastating. Loads of people were institutionalized, including children. Loads of women were sterilized because they were not good enough to reproduce. Segregated, denied opportunities, denied rights. Entire groups of people were judged according to how useful society believed them to be. For perhaps the first time, discrimination was not simply social. It became policy, it became law, and it was presented as science and medicine. That is why this period matters. There was a lot of religious excuses and spiritual excuses still prevalent at this time. Not because eugenics still exists in the same form. It does not anymore, but because some of the assumptions underneath it did not disappear when the movement collapsed, which we will look at in the next slide. The belief that some lives have more value than others, the obsession with fixing difference, the idea that human worth can be measured, those ideas did not vanish. They adapted, changed language, put on a different outfit, and some of those are still sitting quietly in conversations today, which is exactly where our story goes next. After the fall of eugenics, this is between 1945 1970s, the questions and explanations change again. World shock. World War II exposes the dangers of ranking human value, human rights movements grow, medical ethics begin changing. Science rebuilds. Researchers move away from superior versus inferior, greater focus on development and behavior, more systematic observations. New problems appear. Difference is still viewed as disorder. Institutionalization continues heavily. Parents often blamed. The reality, eugenics declined, deficit thinking remained. The policies changed faster than assumptions. Now, there is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. So, after everything we have just talked about, you might assume humanity looked at the aftermath of the Second World War and the First World War and collectively said, right, ranking human beings was a terrible idea. Let's never do that again. And to be fair, many people did. The horrors of Nazi Germany forced societies to confront what happens when prejudice, power, and pseudoscience all decide to become best friends. Human rights movements grew, medical ethics became a much bigger conversation, many eugenic policies were abandoned and scraped away. On paper, things were improving. The problem? Changing laws is much easier than changing assumptions. The policies changed faster than the mindsets. Researchers moved away from the ideas of superior and inferior, which was progress in itself, but difference was still largely viewed as a problem to solve. Something to treat, something to correct, something to fix. The question was no longer, should these people exist? Thankfully. The question became, why aren't they normal? Which is progress, but only in the same way that falling down 3 flights of stairs is better than falling down four. The underlying assumption was still there. There was still an invisible standard, a right way to learn, a right way to behave, a right way to communicate. And if you did not fit in, the problem was assumed to be you, not the system, not society, you. Many disabled people remained institutionalized heavily. Families were encouraged to hide differences rather than understand it. The pressure to appear normal was enormous, and when society cannot explain something history shows us, it has a habit of looking for somebody to blame. Different century, different languages, same bad habit. And before long, attention turned towards parents, particularly mothers. Because apparently, throughout history, if humanity cannot find an answer quickly enough, there is always somebody willing to suggest it must somehow be a lesser human's fault. So, where we talk about gender inequality, women were not seen as equals. So, it was the woman's fault. It was the mother's fault. And unfortunately, that is exactly where our story goes next. Mothers, families, and blame. The theory refrigerator mother. This is between the 1940s and 1970s. Some researchers claimed autism was caused by emotionally distant mothers, lack of maternal warmth, poor parent child bonding, family environment. And I'm not going to lie, industrialization era did not make this easy because women were expected to work a very long hours and take care of the house and reproduce and raise the child. Autism was viewed as a psychological condition rather than neurodevelopmental difference. It was also classed as childhood schizophrenia. The impact. Families were told mothers caused autism, parenting needed correcting, children needed treatment, difference needed fixing. Many parents experienced shame, guilt, isolation, blame. The theory influenced public attitudes for decades. The reality? Research eventually showed autism is a neurodevelopmental issue. Challenge. Genetics play a significant role. Brain development differs from birth. Parents do not cause autism. The theory collapsed. The damage did not disappear so easily. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. So, eugenics begins collapsing. Good. That needed to happen. The problem is that autism did not disappear just because one explanation fell apart. Autistic children were still here. Families were still here. Difference was still here. And society still wanted answers. At the time, very little was understood about genetics, brain development, or neurodevelopment, which would have been perfect opportunity for science to say, we don't know everything yet. We are still studying. Unfortunately, humans are not particularly good for admitting that. It kind of sounds like a narcissistic error, doesn't it? So instead, some researchers came up with a new explanation, the refrigerator mother theory. And yes, that is genuinely what it was called. The theory claimed autism was caused by emotionally distant, cold, or unaffectionate mothers. Because apparently, after centuries of blaming demons, curses, disability, and inferior people, history decided to try blaming women again. A tradition with far more consistency than scientific accuracy. Autism was no longer being seen as something a child was born with. It was seen as something a mother caused. And the consequences were devastating. Families were blamed, parents were judged, mothers carried guilt for something they had never caused. Many spent years believing they had somehow damaged their child simply by existing in the wrong way. Now, I want to take a moment pause here and just say to all the mothers and the women out there, a mum's guilt was produced. Aside from obviously we have natural feeling of are we doing enough? That is normal. But then it was also put into society. It was also put into a mindset. So a lot of what we say now, where we guilt ourselves as mothers, is from somewhere. Now you know why it's there. Now you know where it's from. The frightening part is that this was not fringe thinking. It influenced professionals, services, public attitudes, and family life for decades. Eventually, the evidence caught up. Research increasingly showed autism to be neurodevelopmental. Genetics played a significant role. Differences in brain development were present from birth. The theory collapsed. The guilt did not disappear nearly as quickly. Because once society attaches blame to a group of people, that idea tends to linger long after the evidence has left the building. And that raises a much bigger question. Why were mothers blamed so easily in the first place? To answer that, we need to step back and look at something bigger than autism: the historical treatment of women, minority groups, and anyone who did not fit society's idea of normal. Women, ethnic minorities, and neurodiversity. Women, the missing half. Most early research focused on boys and men. Girls were expected to be quiet, helpful, socially aware. Many autistic girls learned to mask differences from an early age. Women's experiences were often dismissed as emotional, hysterical, hormonal, or personality based. Result: many women spent decades misunderstood rather than recognized. Ethnic minorities, difference within difference. Culture influenced how behavior was interpreted. Language barriers often affected assessment and support. Some communities viewed difference through religious, cultural, or family expectations. Access to diagnosis and services was often unequal. Result: many individuals were overlooked, misdiagnosed, or identified much later. The normal standard. Who defined normal? Research was largely based on white Western male populations, and before someone comes at me, this is documented and actual accurate fact. Diagnostic models reflected those populations. Behavior outside those expectations was easier to miss or misunderstand. Normal often reflected social power rather than human diversity. Result: difference was frequently compared against very narrow benchmark. Lasting impact: the legacy today. Women still receive diagnosis later than men on average, and this is in every area. So, scientifically, medically, women, we are still trying to discover women's medical challenges and issues and illnesses. We are not there yet. Men, on the other hand, we know everything. So, ethnic minority communities continue to face barriers to support. Misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis remain common. Research continues expanding our understanding of neurodiversity. Result: progress continues, but many gaps remain. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. This part matters because whenever we talk about diagnosis, research, understanding neurodiversity, we need to ask one uncomfortable question: who was actually being studied? And I know a lot of you are going to say why I didn't mention two particular people that we historically know were the foundation, were one of the foundation setting for autism. And there's a reason for that, and I hope you catch on and drop me a comment if you do catch on to why. Because for a very long time, the answer was not everyone. Much of the research that shaped our understanding of autism, ADHD, and human behavior was built around boys and men, usually white, usually Western, usually from groups already closest to education, medicine, research, and power. Everyone else was often treated as an afterthought or ignored entirely. And when people defining normal, all from relatively narrow groups, guess what happens? Everyone outside that group starts looking abnormal to everyone. Not because they are, because the measuring stick was biased from the start. For women and girls, the consequences were enormous. Girls were expected to be quiet, helpful, polite, socially aware, and fit in a box. So many learned very early on that being accepted often depended on hiding parts of themselves to conform and to follow rules set out by men. Masking was not a quirky personality trait. For many, it was survival. Not because autism looked different, because society treated girls differently. A boy might be labeled disruptive, a girl might be labeled dramatic. A boy might be labeled energetic, a girl might be called attention seeking. And I want you to remember this language is still used in many parts of the world in 2026. Same behavior, different judgment. Then we get to ethnic minority communities. And this is where history becomes particularly uncomfortable because race, colonialism, and prejudice did not magically disappear when science arrived. They simply put on a lab coat. Entire populations were studied through the lens of racial hierarchies, cultural differences, were often misunderstood. Language barriers were ignored. Communities were judged against standards that were never built with them in mind. And when people did not fit those standards, the assumptions was often that the person was the problem, not the system, not the research, not the assumptions, the person itself. The pattern repeats throughout history far more often than most people are comfortable admitting. The result was that countless women, girls, and people from ethnic minorities were overlooked, misdiagnosed, institutionalized, dismissed, or simply never recognized at all, or became lab rats. Not because they were absent, because the people writing the textbooks were never looking for them. Or worse, they were looking at them through somebody else's lens. And that matters because these are not just historical problems. Women are still diagnosed later today. Girls are still missed today. Ethnic minority communities still face barriers to assessment and support. Research has improved, awareness has improved, access has not improved equally, which brings us right back to the central theme of this entire presentation. The people were always here, the explanations kept changing. Neurodiversity changes the conversation. This is from 1925 to present. And I apologize, I am probably going to murder this name because I don't know how to pronounce it properly, so forgive me. But Grunia Sukariva in 1925. This woman, the woman history forgot, published one of the earliest clinical descriptions resembling modern autism, documented social differences, sensory sensitivities, intense interest, literal thinking, uneven development profiles. And here it is. Her work appeared almost 20 years before Leo Kanner. Lorna Wing, 1980s, the woman who changed understanding. She was an autistic parent, psychiatrist, and a researcher. Introduced the autism spectrum that we see today. Wider recognition of autistic presentations, greater awareness of girls and overlooked individuals, that included ethnic minorities, helped move autism beyond the narrow stereotypes. Judy Singer, 1990s, the woman who changed the language. Australian sociologist coined the term neurodiversity, argued neurological differences are a part of natural human variation rather than simply disorders to eliminate. Autistic self advocate, nothing about us without us. Autistic people increasingly began speaking for themselves rather than being spoken for. Focus shifted toward acceptance, accommodation, inclusion, lived experience, human rights. The biggest breakthrough was not discovering different minds, it was finally listening to them. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. After everything we have covered so far, I think it is important to talk about people who changed the conversation because history has a habit of remembering the loudest voices, not always the first ones. One of those people was Grunya Sukariva. Now, unless neurodiversity history is your chosen special interest, there is a good chance you have never heard of her, which is unfortunate because in 1925 she published descriptions of children that many researchers today recognize as remarkably similar to autism. In other words, she was noticing many of the same traits we still discuss today. She was also doing something surprisingly rare for the time. She described strengths alongside difficulties. She observed the children rather than simply measuring how far they fell from some imaginary standard. A concept humanity has historically struggled with. Then came Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger. Their work helped establish autism within the medical literature. That contribution is huge, but their research also reflected the limitations of the time. The people studied were often very narrow group. Girls were missed, ethnic minority communities were missed, people who masked were missed. Not because they did not exist, because nobody was looking for them. Then came along Lorna Wing. And this is where the picture starts getting bigger. As both psychiatrist and a parent of an autistic daughter, she was seeing people who did not fit the narrow descriptions being used at the time. She helped popularize the idea of the autism spectrum. Not a single presentation, not a single experience, a spectrum. And suddenly, a lot of people who had been invisible started becoming visible. Then, in the 1990s, Judy Singer introduced the term neurodiversity, and the conversation shifted again. For centuries, society had mostly asked, how do we make different people more normal? How can we fix them? Now people started asking, what if neurological differences are a natural part of human variation? And before anyone launches a chair across the room, that does not mean disappears. It does not mean support needs disappear. It means difference itself is no longer automatically treated as a defect. But perhaps the biggest shift was not medical, it was social. Autistic people started speaking for themselves, which sounds obvious, yet humanity somehow spent centuries discussing people rather than listening to them. The phrase nothing about us without us became central to disability rights and self advocacy movements. Because if this entire presentation has taught us anything, it is this: the people were always here. The difference was always here. The biggest breakthrough was not discovering different minds. It was finally listening to them and learning to let go of the old explanations. Evolution of language. So there are four arches here, and all four of them, you've heard these words. I want you to connect these. Fear and superstition, ancient world to 1700s. We use the words cursed, possessed, touched by spirits, morally flawed, punished by God, strange, difference explained through belief and spirituality and religion. Control and conformity, 1700s to early 1900s. Feeble minded, idiot, imbecile, defective, abnormal, unfit. Difference measured against society's expectations. Medicalization between the 1900s and the 1980s. Disorder, impaired, dysfunction, retarded, maladjusted, behavior problems, special needs. Difference viewed primarily through deficits. Identity and understanding from 1990s to present. Neurodivergent, neurotypical, autistic persons, support needs, accommodation, inclusion. Difference increasingly viewed as a part of human diversity. Language does not just describe reality, it shapes how people understand it. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. One thing I want people to notice throughout this entire presentation is that whilst human difference remained remarkably consistent, the language used to describe it never stopped changing. And that matters because language is not just for communication, it is how societies explain things, categorize things, decide what is considered normal. Every era had its own vocabulary: cursed, possessed, defective, disordered, neurodivergent. The person may have stayed exactly the same, the explanation changed. What people often forget is that for most of human history, education was a privilege. Many people could not read. Many never had access to formal education. Even well into the 12th century, access to knowledge varied massively depending on where you lived, your class, your gender, and your opportunities. Most people learned through family, religion, culture, and community. So people often repeated the only explanations they had ever been given. As education expanded, language became more technical. Medicine developed its own language, psychology developed its own language, research developed its own language, which sounds great until you realize most people are not sitting at home reading diagnostic manuals for fun. Researchers speak one language, professionals speak another, families speak another. And that is the gap where misunderstanding thrives because people do not just hear words, they attach meaning to them. That is why language keeps evolving, not because society enjoys inventing new terminology every 5 minutes, because old language often failed people. Sometimes it dismissed them, sometimes it misunderstood them, sometimes it actively caused harm. Even today, we still hear they don't look autistic. Everyone is a little bit autistic. All children do that. They just need to try harder. Different words, same old assumption that the person's experience is not really that significant. And that is a pattern I want you to notice. History has a habit of updating the vocabulary whilst quietly keeping the assumption underneath it. Which brings us right back to the biggest theme of this presentation. The people changed far less than the explanations did. The labels evolved, the language evolved. The real question is whether our understanding evolved with it. The world is still catching up. Research has moved forward. Better understanding of autism and ADHD, improved diagnostic frameworks, growing recognition of diversity, more autistic voices being heard. Systems are still catching up. Long waiting lists, unequal access to support, underfunded services, inconsistent educational provision. We all know this. Old assumptions still appear. Productivity over well being, compliance over understanding, stereotypes over reality, visibility over actual need. The challenge today: knowledge exists, evidence exists, lived experience exists. Applying it consistently remains the challenge. The conversation has changed, the world is still catching up. There is a megaphone in the corner, so keep listening. If there is one thing I want people to take away from this presentation, it is this: the conversation has changed. The world is still catching up. Those are not the same thing. Today, we have more knowledge than any generation before us. We have neuroscience, research, diagnostic frameworks, lived experience, autistic voices. We know more than our ancestors could ever have imagined. And yet, knowledge has never been the hardest part. History has shown us that repeatedly. Education is still a privilege in many parts of the world. Access to information is unequal. Access to healthcare is unequal. Access to diagnosis is unequal. Access to support is unequal. But even when information exists, people still decide what they listen to, what they dismiss, what they fund, what they teach, what they believe, and who they believe. And that has been the pattern running through this entire presentation. Human difference remained remarkably consistent. The explanations kept changing. Sometimes those explanations became religion, sometimes culture, sometimes science, sometimes law, and sometimes it became common sense. And every generation convinced itself it finally had the answer. Yet, here we are, still arguing about who deserves support, who is disabled enough, still arguing about who is struggling enough, still rewarding conformity, still measuring human value through productivity, still asking people to fit systems that were never designed with them in mind. The uncomfortable truth is that information alone has never created understanding. If it did, history would look very different. Knowledge exists, evidence exists, lived experience exists. The challenge has never been whether the information is available. The challenge has always been what society chooses to do with it. Because throughout history, people have repeatedly tried to force difference into a box, explain it, control it, correct it, fix it, rank it, and sometimes, unfortunately, eliminate it. Yet difference remained. Not because humanity failed, because difference is part of humanity. It always was. Perhaps progress is not about creating a better box. Perhaps it is finally accepting that human beings were never supposed to fit inside one. And if this presentation has taught us anything, I hope it is this: the people were always there, the difference was always here. The opportunity in front of us is deciding whether future generations inherit understanding or just another explanation. If you found this presentation helpful, please consider subscribing and supporting future projects from The Inclusive Voice. This resource was created to be shared, discussed, and used by anyone who may find it valuable. The researchers, organizations, and key sources referenced throughout this presentation are listed on the next page. To create this video, I reviewed loads of historical records, academic journals, research papers, books, publications from multiple disciplinaries. There simply is not enough room to include every source within a single presentation. If there was one thing I hope you take away from this video, it is this. Human difference is not new. It never was. Across history, the people often stayed the same. What changed were the explanations, the language, the assumptions, the systems. And sometimes those explanations helped people, sometimes they harmed them. Understanding that history helps us recognize the assumptions we still carry today. Stay curious, ask questions, read widely, challenge old ideas when the evidence points elsewhere. Most importantly, remember that behind every label, diagnosis, statistics, and theory is a human being. Thank you for spending your time with me. I will see you in the next video. About this resource and the list that you see, I just want to say, alongside reviewing over 100 sources, articles, journals, publications, this presentation has been informed by my ongoing Bachelor in Science open degree studies, specializing in psychology, neuroscience, and child development and sociology. The aim is not to provide clinical advice, but to encourage evidence based discussion, critical thinking, and greater understanding of neurodiversity through historical and societal lens. Thank you.